Good morning, everybody. I hope everyone is doing well. I know quite a few faces on this call. Not everyone, but I am excited to see you all. My name is, for those of you who don't know me, my name is Laura Hennon. I am a member of the PRSA Board of Directors, have been a PRSA member for a very, very long time. And then I also, in my daytime, work at Medtronic in communications. So a few months ago, Eva was looking for topics, and I had suggested a good friend of mine, Dr. Amy Prasik. I don't usually call her Dr. Prasik, but it's appropriate today. Amy's been a friend of mine. We were reminiscing over coffee on Friday prepping for this. We figured it's probably been about 15 years now um, that since we've known each other.
Yeah.
So yeah, so Amy is I'm going to give you guys a little bit of her like mini bio, just to kind of set the ground of why she's so qualified to talk to imposter syndrome with us today, and then you'll see that this is a really unique opportunity to deep dive into it. In the chat, Eva had put an article that just showed up yesterday and in PRSA in their blog, and we're saying there's so much out there about it, but it only goes pretty surface level. And what Amy can present us as something much deeper and really thoughtful and kind of a true look at what it actually means. So let me tell you a little bit about Amy, and I'm just going to read from her bio on her company website, but not word for word. So Amy is a integrative therapies researcher and educator, and uniquely, which I think is really interesting for our audience, is her research and focus has been on the use of meaningful technology solutions to reduce symptoms of chronic stress, anxiety, and depression. Her expertise and in the fieldwork is particularly centered on the use of popular media and online programs to communicate and deliver mental health education and practices in accessible ways. Amy has multiple degrees. I mean, I call her Dr. Prasik for a reason. I think she has, in addition to having a PhD, which is why I can call her Dr. Prasik, she has an MA in health communications, so she gets our world. She also has an MA in holistic health studies. If you need a really good yoga instructor, I can tell you Amy is a wonderful one. I've taken many a yoga class from her as well, but that's not why we're
Thanks,
here today.
Laura. No, not today.
We're not going to do yoga. No, namaste. Um, Amy's, she's done so much. She's done a ton of research. She was actually a Dalai Lama fellow with the U of M. I mean, she's just incredible. She's also a dog lover and a gardener like me. So that's how we became friends, is taking our pups on walks when we were neighbors. So
Yeah.
I'm excited to hand this over to my dear friend. So what we're going to do is, if you have questions, throughout, Amy's got about maybe 20-ish minutes to chat with us. I have a few prepared questions for her to kind of follow up on sort of what we talked about, what we talked about today. But feel free to pop questions in the chat. And then at the end, I will moderate some questions. We want to allow a good chunk of time for Q&A and for this to be really interactive today. So with that, I'm going to hand this over to our guest, Amy Prasik. Thanks, Amy.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. Um, Hi everyone. Thanks for having me this morning. I want to put some slides up because I will have some things for us to be able to kind of track with some strategies. So give me a moment. Let me see if I can do this. All right. Do you see the title of our talk? Yeah. Okay, cool. So yes, please drop anything in the chat. Let me see. Hold on. Let me pull this chat up too. Okay. And then we will have Q&A at the end, as Laura said, but I want to make this a bit more of a discussion, and I do want to get into some of the deeper aspects of imposter phenomenon. So, yeah, we're gonna go a little deep, but we're not gonna go too deep. I'm gonna give you lots of strategies and additional tools that you can kind of go deeper after this talk. That's my hope. So maybe you notice here the talk uh, of today is ditching the imposter narrative, and maybe you've already noticed that I didn't put imposter syndrome in there, and that's very purposeful. I think imposter syndrome is a myth, actually. So we're going to get into that today. And I hope by the time our hour is done that you leave feeling more gentle with yourself if you have these kind of imposter feelings. If you struggle with this, I hope you leave with some strategies to help you. And then maybe you'll agree at the end that imposter syndrome is a myth. So in this first half together, um, So used to giving agendas with all my talks too. So here's our agenda. We'll get into some factors, or we'll get into a definition first. I want to make sure that we all have a good handle of what we're talking about. Um, we'll do a little bit of myth busting, and then I want to introduce 6 key factors that contribute to imposter phenomenon or imposter feelings, and some strategies to address those. So let's get into some terms and definitions. Hang with me here. This is important. So, again, we've all probably heard the word imposter syndrome, but that's not the original term. So, imposter syndrome is actually kind of a bad remix, I'd say, of imposter phenomenon, which is the original term coined about 50 years ago from doctors Pauline Clance and Suzanne Imes. So, there are lots of definitions of imposter phenomenon. I do like this one from Alouati and colleagues. They described imposter phenomenon as an internalized sense of intellectual deceit and persistent self doubt, even with evidence of competence. So, let me explain that with a little bit more history and examples. Also, first, just to avoid the tongue twister, I'm going to try to use the acronym IP for imposter phenomenon to help us a little bit. It'll be a little shorter. And I'll also use the word imposter feelings. So, just a little heads up there. So, in Clance and Imes' classic study, this is in 1978, they noticed that accomplished women in academia, despite all of their achievements, often felt like frauds, described themselves as frauds. And in the research, these common kind of narratives and expressions of self doubt came up that I think many of us can relate to. Things like, it was just luck that they approved my project or I got that promotion. They're going to ask me something that I don't know and I'll be found out. Then they'll know for sure that I'm a fraud. Everybody else is on it. I don't know what I'm doing. I can't get it together and I'm the only one. So, anybody kind of relate to some of these feelings? Yes. IP is so common. Imposter phenomenon is so common. In fact, the seeds of it, like this tendency toward it, is woven into our mammalian human fabric in ways that support our evolutionary survival as a species. Like it is that much in our DNA. This tendency to compare ourselves with others is completely natural. However, it is a problem when it goes too far or when we're way off in our comparisons. We'll get into some of why that happens in a moment. But do know that this is common. And there is no one particular demographic that is consistently more strongly associated with experiencing IP across like this diverse body of research. We can get into more of that later if folks want to. I think there might be demographics more open to talking about it, but this really is a universal experience. So IP has really 2 big components that are important to notice. Our self-assessment is skewed. That's the first one. So our assessment is off. We are capable, but we think we aren't. And then, of course, these feelings of self-doubt, of feeling like a fraud, those are real. So when I say imposter syndrome is a myth, I am not dismissing the real feelings that exist. So we have a skewed self-assessment. We have these fraudy feelings that feed each other. These feelings feed this skewed assessment. The skewed assessment continues to feed these feelings, and they keep cycling. And so there's all of these factors then that come in and kind of ignite and fuel this cycle. And those are the factors that we'll get into in a moment. So I want to say again, this is not a syndrome. A syndrome, if those of you in healthcare, it suggests a clear constellation of symptoms that can lead to a specific condition with a direct cause. And syndromes usually move into diseases once those factors kind of get sorted out. This is not that. And so, even though it's not a syndrome or a disease, there is a common cure that seems to get kind of pushed onto us, like it's messaged to us, sold to us. And it's that imposter syndrome is the word these generally is used in these contexts. It is a problem with self-esteem. So if you have imposter feelings, you have poor self-esteem. The research is really clear here that self-esteem is only a small factor contributing to IP. So you can have high self-esteem and feel like an imposter. These are not mutually exclusive. We'll get into those 6 factors that are much more impactful in a moment. So know that you are not broken in some way if you have these feelings. This is a normal human experience that can go awry, and we can recalibrate it back with practices, skills, and strategies. This is a phenomenon, and experience are some really universal similarities, patterns that we can all kind of resonate with, that we can talk about and say, oh my God, yeah, I've felt like that. But it's also really individual. So the reasons why we might feel like an imposter, they all have their own story. And also the ways that we're going to go about reducing it, even though there's familiar paths that we can take, kind of universal paths, those steps on those paths are going to be really different. All right, so enough teasing of these factors. Let's get into it. These are the 6 biggest factors that really contribute to imposter phenomenon. Let's start with anxiety, because we can probably all relate. Anxiety is one of the strongest predictors of imposter feelings. It is kind of the undercurrent of IP in a lot of ways. And it really makes sense. So just, a bit of what happens with anxiety. When we're anxious or stressed or in chronic stress, we're activated. So our system is activated and our perspective is narrow. This is important when it comes to imposter feelings. And I mean literally. So our sensory system is narrowed. Our thoughts can get tunneled. Our system is looking out for threats and we're in surveillance mode. And that can distort everything. Our self-assessment, our assessment of external challenges, of external comparisons, of our perceived flaws. And so often, if we're not aware of this undercurrent of anxiety, that stress activation can also kind of drive us to engage in efforts to prove ourselves. So we overwork, we over prepare, we burn ourselves out in order to prove something. So, how can we go about it reducing anxiety? Really, in the context of IP, it can be highly responsive to skills training and therapies like CBT, so cognitive behavioral therapy. And there's lots of tools out there beyond seeking out counseling. There are lots of online tools for CBT. ACT, acceptance and commitment therapy, is also a great one. DBT, dialectical behavioral therapy, is really helpful, particularly the work around distress tolerance that's done in DBT can be super helpful for imposter feelings. And you can do that work outside of DBT too. So distress tolerance is getting better at being more comfortable with being uncomfortable, which is hugely beneficial. And then there's mind body practices. So practices that help us to move mindfully and get into our body more in a positive way and kind of out of our cycling thoughts and ruminations. So this can be anything that you really bring your attention to. It doesn't have to be just yoga. It could be dance, any kind of martial arts, walking in the woods, cycling, weightlifting, really anything kind of movement that that has a bit of a rhythmic or repetitive nature so that you can attend to it. You can give your full attention to it and kind of come out of the cycling thoughts. And so for each factor, as I noted before, I did put in a few podcast episodes. So I'm the co-host for the Joy Lab podcast with Dr. Henry Emmons, who's an integrative psychiatrist. And so these are the episodes that kind of address each factor. So I can also send these to somebody who could get these to everyone in some way. Yeah.
I will do that.
Okay,
Absolutely. And
cool.
I'll put the link to JoyLab in the chat too while you're talking here.
Sweet, sweet. Okay, so yeah, when it comes to IP, I think work with distress tolerance can be really helpful, as I noted, um, and with emotional reactivity. So equanimity is this kind of concept that we work on at Joy Lab, also in mental health as it's becoming more of a common practice. Equanimity practices they can be really helpful to kind of ease anxiety as we're working through particularly emotional reactivity and emotional regulation. So these are some great um, episodes to help you if you're kind of like resonating with that. Um, okay, so anxiety is going to rise up again and again. I'm gonna pause there with anxiety because it will come up again, as we all know. So the second factor is that you don't know everything, and that's okay. And this technically isn't even imposter phenomenon. It's not IP because you might have a correct assessment that you don't know something in your work. So you are correct. You might not know what you're doing. Um, your self-assessment is correct. Welcome to adulting, right? When when it gets to be sticky, a problem is after you have that assessment of the correct assessment that you don't know, what do you do next? Do you just attack yourself, berate yourself? Do you hide? All very common reactions to not knowing something and wanting or needing to know it. And the kind of sort of scientific term that applies here is something called uncertainty tolerance. So, uncertainty tolerance has to do with our many kind of psychological responses to the conscious awareness that we don't know something. And for a lot of reasons, we might have more negative than positive responses to that awareness of not knowing. So we need to bravely get more comfortable with not knowing. It's like the distress tolerance I just noted in anxiety. Get more comfortable with being uncomfortable. We can do this through a lot of strategies. I like the work around intellectual humility and practices to cultivate that. And I think it's really important to look at our environment since we're kind of coming from a corporate frame now as we gather this morning. Like, check in with your corporate culture. How is uncertainty handled? Do you feel comfortable saying, I don't know? Can you ask questions? Can you seek out support? Specifically around this area of not knowing, of lacking knowledge that you feel like you might need. If you can't bring those things up and hold uncertainty, imposter feelings thrive in those type of corporate cultures. And outside of your corporate bubble, this is really a treacherous undercurrent that we have, particularly in US culture, in and out of corporate culture. And it's just, it's so pervasive and it's so impactful that we really have to start recognizing this, right? Admitting uncertainty, not knowing something is often perceived as a weakness. I'll talk about that more in a bit. But if we can learn anything from every economic crash, nearly every collapse of civilizations throughout history, it's that kind of toxic black and white thinking and lack of uncertainty tolerance. This lack of intellectual humility absolutely takes us down every time. So that was a bit of Armageddon level ending there, but an encouragement, I hope, to engage in this type of intellectual humility practices. So we can strengthen our uncertainty tolerance. There are so many skills that do that. We can practice intellectual humility skills that help us to be open to reconsidering our views, to avoid defensiveness when we're challenged, another one, and to reduce that felt need to be right. So these are really powerful practices to decrease imposter feelings. Also, might I add, if you realize that you don't know something, that is an intellectual strength. I love the research on this with like the Dunning-Kruger effect. Maybe folks are familiar with that. Essentially, it's the phenomenon where the less you know, the more you think you know. So if you don't think you know something, and even more if you can admit it, you are winning. You are a smart cookie. That is an intellectual strength. It is not rewarded in culture, but it is starting to change. And it is a practice that we can work on. So here are some episodes if you'd like to work with intellectual humility. We didn't do a series on it, but again, I'll send this off to you. Are you curious to learn or confirm? Getting comfy with not knowing. So I'm gonna hop forward though here. All right. Third factor. This one I think is really interesting for this group of PR practitioners. Perhaps, I might be assuming. Um, but I mean, broadly, US culture rewards extroversion, speaking up, networking, self promotion, while undervaluing the quiet strengths of introverts. There's a ton of research here. And being an introvert in an extroverted world is associated with imposter feelings. So, again, I don't know. Would folks perhaps agree that PR has a lot of pressure to be kind of extroverted? Maybe yes in the chat, no in the chat. I'd be curious to see. And if you feel like you're an introvert in an extroverted world, um, it can be difficult. Yeah.
Mhm. I would say working with so many communicators, like I'm an extrovert, but I have a lot of introverts that I work with,
Ah,
and you almost feel like you have to put on that extroverted face in a meeting and other things. So I think that's really relevant, Amy.
yes. Okay, perfect. You kind of nailed what actually happens. So there's a disconnect here, right? You feel like you're an introvert in an extroverted world or field specifically. It can be really hard. You may, like you said, Laura, be feel you're forced to put on a mask. It's something that's sometimes called performance persona, where you spend a lot of your energy to play a character that you feel like is needed, that you feel like is more beneficial for you. And that flexibility is okay. There's a lot of research around that, this plurality, this openness and flexibility in how we express ourselves, but it does need to be tethered, anchored to our core. Um, but so as an introvert, maybe you need to do some public speaking in the role of of your job here. Um, but if that becomes something like a constant performance, then it can be extremely exhausting, right? So, a few strategies here in the context of work are to actually lean into those quiet strengths. So, the creativity, the empathy, the deep thinking that introversion can afford us. And I guess the hardest part here is to self promote those strengths so that they can become seen and valued enough for them to get noticed. Another strategy here is to share more aspects with yourself with trusted people. Some of this introversion imposter phenomenon association has to do with folks who are more introverted, may feel more hesitant to share aspects of themselves with others. So, what happens there is that there's lots of pieces of you that maybe you're not expressing to the world. So then you feel like the world doesn't really get you, that you're not seen, you're not understood. If you combine that with a performance persona at work, it can create a really big disconnect from who you are and who people think you are, who you think people think you are. And that gap can really fuel imposter feelings. You feel like the world doesn't get you, doesn't see you. Um, I'm just reading from Keely here. Oh, good stuff. Okay. Yes, my best to allow them to be introverted. Yeah, leaders who see introversion as strengths, creating powerful teams. It's starting to change more. The book Quiet is wonderful. If anybody's read that, I have it on my bookshelf. Now I can't remember who the author is. Maybe if somebody knows, they can pop it in. Otherwise, I'll grab it. I can see it, but I can't read the author. Um, some strategies here, kind of a different approach to address these strategies. Actually, something called deep listening. So we did a series on listening deeply or deep listening practices. This can be really helpful as a way to listen to ourselves and others in a more compassionate way. It can be really helpful for kind of balancing or playing in that space of introversion and extroversion or ambiversion, those of you who fall in the middle and move around. So let's keep moving. And I'm tracking some of these questions. Um, yes. Okay. Actually, we're going to kind of get into Daniel's question here in a moment. So this fourth factor has to do with prioritizing performance goals over learning goals. So performance goals have to do with external validation. I am learning in order to gain self-worth. to have your approval validate my knowledge. Does that make sense? So, on the other hand, learning goals are driven by curiosity and the desire for growth. I want to learn because learning is important to me. Growth is important to me. And this is kind of a sneaky factor because I think we have a lot of performance goals and performance motivation that is unconscious to us. It's also what's pushed in so many aspects of our lives. We are fueled by media validation, how many followers we have on social, or fueled to try and gain some kind of status symbol, a car, a house, a handbag, whatever. It's this kind of acquisition to fuel our self-worth. It's very fragile because it can be taken away just as quickly as it's given. So when these kinds of performance goals take the reins, we can really get stuck in IP because our actions, our life is validated on something outside ourselves. So we're always checking the score, trying to measure up to those external factors, those external rulers. So some of the work to go beyond this can be sometimes what's called secular values work, essentially working to cultivate these more positive inner states, virtues that fuel us from within. So compassion, humility, equanimity, savoring, curiosity. We do a lot of this work at Joy Lab actually, but coming into these secular values, virtues, positive inner states as a way to kind of anchor the internal locus of control and these learning goals so that they can be drivers. You might be familiar with Carol Dweck's work here, research on fixed versus growth mindsets. So this really applies here. It gives us some tools to combat this, to move more into learning goals as well. So a fixed mindset is really the view that my intelligence, my abilities, my talents, my traits are pretty much set in stone. It's usually genetic, mostly unchangeable. A growth mindset is the view that there's a lot of room in all of that for growth. It's not a belief that you'll win or be the best, but it's that you can learn and that you can grow. And we can practice this growth mindset. We can build these skills. So, self-compassion is also a big factor here. We did a series on self-compassion, episodes 26 through 28, that can be helpful. All right, we're gonna keep moving here so that we can have discussion time. I want to get in this fifth factor. This is that you had to be an imposter. So this really has to do with how we grew up, and the research here comes from work that looked at imposter phenomenon and correlations with something called the family environment scale. So this is a scale that looks at the relationships between family members and then also kind of the broader functioning and organizational structure of a family. Okay, so I'll kind of get into this with the subscales that I want to note here. So there are 4 subscales, important subscales within this family environment scale that are associated with imposter phenomenon pretty strongly so. It's the cohesion and expressiveness subscales and the conflict and control subscales. Okay, I'm going to get into these. So cohesion looks at how supportive family members are of each other, like how they root for each other, how they're there to support each other. Expressiveness refers to kind of the degree of acceptance for each other's feelings, letting each other feel the feels. So if you had a parent that would kind of come down on you if you expressed anger or sadness or jealousy or many of the, millions and zillions of other expressions that we know kids arise with at every minute, that if those things are pushed down, then that creates in this subscale when they're looking at how this relates to imposter phenomenon, that creates low expressiveness in that subscale. Okay, so with cohesion and expressiveness, the higher, I'm sorry, I flipped those. I'm getting all wrapped up in my scales here. So in those 2 scales, the higher the expressiveness and cohesion, the lower the imposter scores. Yes, I'm sorry. Does that make sense? So, um, yeah. So, a family system that is encouraging folks to express their emotions and providing support in general is going to have lower imposter scores. We can talk about this more too if folks want to, but I want to hit on the conflict subscale and the control subscale as well. Your gut is right on these. The conflict subscale looks at the amount of expressed anger and like general conflict in the family, just kind of fighting or that kind of tense state. Um, Here's what they found. The more conflict, the more imposter feelings. The control subscale measures how strong rules and procedures guide family behaviors. And this is really about an environment of like rigid control, like a dictator in the house who is rigid and unforgiving, who needs high control. And when kids grow up in this kind of high control environment, imposter phenomena is more likely. And I should note, this is not like all about kids. You might even, when I'm going over these subscales, you're like, oh, I see that in my corporate culture. Um, so these things show up in units, in organizational structures as well. Um, and again, it's not just about kids. You might be the one creating the low cohesion and expressiveness and high control and conflict in your family unit or in your sort of organizational structures, and your scores will suffer for imposter phenomenon as well. Or you're the spouse of someone who's like this, your scores will suffer too. So, what happens in these types of environments often is what's called the development of a false self. So we create a false self to please whoever is trying to stifle us or whoever we believe we need to pacify or prove something to. And just that, this creation of a false self takes us away from who we are, obviously, and it amplifies imposter feelings because we are not letting folks see us. We are being trained to not let folks see us, see who we are, see the ways we feel, and see the ways we move in this world. And this false self can really take hold. It can trick us for a long time. Um, but we can work on this. I don't want everybody to leave hating their parents. We're all doing the best we can. um, but it's really important to recognize this because it is a training ground that can be untrained, but until we see it, it really just kind of goes under the current, especially if we were trained that way growing up and it's maybe not part of our structures or units now. It is still an undercurrent if we haven't maybe, kind of put a light touch on it at least. This is great work to do in individual or group therapy to kind of share these childhood experiences, working on emotional regulation skills, guided visualizations that work with letting emotions rise and feeling them and letting them process and move through us. That's also great work to do. Authenticity work can be really helpful too. Um, Journaling, narrative therapy, creative pursuits, ways of just kind of coming back into touch with your true self. There are lots of ways to address this and ways to improve this factor. Um, we can significantly decrease our own imposter feelings. And I think what's so cool about this as well is if you have kids in your life and or if you're a leader in your work, you can decrease the risk of imposter feelings all the way around by attending to this. So, yeah, we did a series on authenticity that I think is really great. So if you're looking for more support around that, kind of getting back in touch with those aspects of yourself, episodes 216 through 220 are really helpful. Okay, last slide, and then we'll chat. Impossible expectations. We've hit on this a bit with uncertainty tolerance and extroversion pressures, but it is essential to call this out specifically because when it comes to imposter feelings and anxiety, they can be a consequence so often of unfairly expecting too many unnecessary things from ourselves and others. So, this is at the individual and societal levels. There is pressure to know all the things, never make a mistake, to get married once and have two kids, of course, to have an impeccable mid century modern home, fresh out of some fancy interior decorating magazine, to never get sick. And if you do, to recover back to exactly where you were before, to wear these clothes, to show the right emotions at the right time, to take this much time for your grief, to be that much sad and take that much time, to weigh this much, to say this much, to know this much, to make healthy meals daily. I could go on and on. It is absolutely exhausting. And not only is it exhausting, it is impossible. And it breeds at best a lot of anxiety and a lot of imposter feelings. So, feeling like an imposter in an impossible system is not a flaw, it is an accurate perception. You should feel like an imposter in a system, or under a set of self determined expectations that are impossible. You'll never do it. You'll never check off all the boxes. These are unrealistic expectations that can lead to overwork, exhaustion, chronic stress, all of which feed right back into imposter feelings. This is work we all need to do, like from top to bottom, individual, micro, macro, assessing our expectations. What are they? Who is setting them? Are they possible? Are they realistic? Do you agree with them? And then start by pruning the ones that you don't align with and that are easier to prune away. I think once we start doing that, kind of take the, so to speak, low hanging fruit off, it can really help us to start challenging those bigger expectations and societal expectations and assumptions and put the policies in place to make those things actually happen. Um, the other thing I want to note here is that we have a really unhealthy relationship with rest and play in US culture. It's something called idleness aversion, actually, but we've put it on steroids. We could talk about that more if we need. This, it's just this aversion to rest, to not being entertained or seemingly productive. It like makes us very uncomfortable. There's some great research with idleness aversion, and they'll hook people up to a shocking machine, and they'll put them in a room by themselves, and they'll say, okay, you got 15 minutes. We'll be back in 15 minutes. You don't want to press a space bar. That'll give you a shock, but we'll be back in 15 minutes. They don't have anything to do. They don't have a phone. They have nothing to do. It's just this blank room. People shock themselves. 25% of people shock themselves. Men tend to shock themselves about at a 50% rate. So they just press that space bar. Instead of being idle, we would rather shock ourselves. It's very interesting. So we need to reclaim this. We need to reclaim this rest, this relationship with rest. And then when we can embrace it, it softens imposter feelings. Okay, I should stop. We should talk. So I hope I've given us some like things to consider,
I,
and to maybe frame some of our discussion here.
Amy, based on the number of questions getting in the Q&A, you've given us lots to consider. So I think I'm just gonna just read from it. But before I do that, I want to just give anybody who wants to chime in live a chance. There's a lot in the chat, and I will go through them. Thank you, everybody who submitted them. Does anybody else want to pop
Yeah.
up before I go to those? All right, cool. All right, so I just want to double down on a comment that Jenny made in the chat that I think is so good. And if you haven't been following the chat, I think it's a good one to call out, especially because we always hear, I feel like in like the last 5, maybe 10 years, we've been hearing this whole narrative around bring your whole self to work. And like, Amy was talking about, we're all a different part of ourselves in different settings. I'm one person with my family, with my children, with my husband, with my friends, with work, with PRSA, whatever it may be. So I just think that Jenny said, when I am my true self, there are repercussions. So I rarely show my true self in a work setting. And I think that's so true. I mean, HR folks like to say, bring your whole self to work and we want you to be who you are. But, I had this great analogy of, I was given in a ID&E session we did, and it was a trainer telling our CEO, it was at Blue Cross at the time, like, don't put on the penguin suit. You're not a penguin, and you're going to go in the room and everybody's going to have the penguin suit on. Don't become a penguin. Be the exuberant ostrich or whatever the analogy was that you are. And I think that's such a great point, Jenny, is that there, we that can be a real challenge. And I think a lot of what Amy said here is doubles down on all the reasons for that. So thank you for calling that out. I'm just going to real
Mm.
quick, I think you touched on this a bit, Amy, but I'm just going to, in the interest of honoring every question, Dan had added self-sabotage and procrastination related to imposter feelings. Anything else to add to that point?
Self-sabotage. What was the other piece?
Procrastination.
Oh, yeah. I mean, usually it links up to the research with perfectionism and imposter feelings, which kind of anchors back to expectations, learning goals. But it's really about understanding too. Um, there's some research as well on like fear of success, fear on failure, but a lot of those are sort of embedded in those six factors. So I think if you can see like where that self-sabotage might be rooted, sometimes it's in just like anxiety, generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety can be rooted in there, impossible expectations, fixed mindset. So usually I think it helps to like put it into a category that gives you some strategies. There's some great research on the benefits of procrastination, which I think is like a different topic for another day, perhaps. But I think it also relates to our unhealthy relationship with rest and just this really interesting research too around, you know, when we give ourselves rest and this grace to rest, these fallow seasons, that we start to have a really different relationship with productivity and procrastination. There's some great research around something called pathological productivity, which I think is really interesting. Um, okay, but I will stop there. But yeah, so finding these places where we can root or where we can kind of categorize where that self-sabotage might be coming in, and then find those strategies within those factors, I think can be helpful.
Awesome. Thank you, Amy. All right, Daryl had a good question. There's a feeling that the narrative can lead to an ongoing cycle of harmful behavior and negative outcomes, a fixed trait. What would you say to that? And then he noted, I read some MIT research debunking that.
The feeling that the narrative can lead to an ongoing cycle of harmful and negative outcome. Daryl, can you? I guess I'm not totally sure on like the narrative, like the imposter narrative can lead to an ongoing cycle of straight. Maybe if you could add a little bit more context, because I think I'm getting your question, which is very interesting. And I want to read that MIT study.
Yeah, just the overall syndrome that it's something fixed. Once you're in it, you can't get out of it.
Ooh,
Fixed.
yes. Yes, yes. Yeah, that's the syndrome. That's the problem with the syndrome language. I love the understanding as a phenomenon because it's just an observable thing, and it reminds us that a lot of these feelings are anchored in very common processes, um, like self-evaluation, um, like self-comparison, which are all very important parts of self-awareness, right? So if you are a self-aware human, you also are a self-evaluative human, which if we're not bringing some training and strategies around that can turn into a really self-critical human, because we're trying to protect ourselves. So it's just like there's this great space in there for all of this training and realizing that this stuff is not set in stone. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's great. I'm glad that MIT is debunking some of that. Awesome. Will you pop that, Daryl, if you can? Will you pop that in the chat?
Oh, where I saw that?
Yeah, maybe if you still know where it is, but don't go
Yeah, I'll
hunting
look
for
it
it.
up. I think I
Yeah.
still got it on my saved
That's awesome.
file.
Otherwise, we'll follow up with it later too. Thanks, Daryl.
Sure.
All right. Amy, another Amy on the call. We have has a great question, and I'm going to add a little context around this too, because I was thinking about the same thing. How do these imposter tendencies show up specifically in PR roles? What can we do to help professionals navigate them or counteract them? And I feel this. Um, a lot of times in PR, we have the privilege and maybe the intimidation of having to lead up. We lead up, we lead down, we lead parallel, right? So in PR roles, we are often presenting to leadership and saying, here's my recommendation based on my expertise. And I think this is especially hard if you're dealing with like a crisis or a critical issue, or you're asking for significant amount of money for a project, a program, it's often like, am I really the smartest kid in the room? Because I'm telling this to like an SVP, an EVP, a CEO, et cetera, et cetera. But that's where I feel like imposter syndrome often comes in. So, and that's one example. I think that's also true navigating down if you have a team, navigating to business partners of from, telling the legal person from a PR lens, I don't agree with you isn't always easy to do. Do you have any thoughts on that of how we can, navigate that in a work setting, knowing kind of some of the specifics with the type of work we do?
Well, I mean, you all are the wisest creatures in this space, and you're seeing it. I guess I think I want to say something about something called infiltrator experience, but I'll hold that off for a moment.
Laura,
Because
I'll
it,
just respond to your comment, which is maybe one way to overcome that is to think of things that you've learned from younger people, right? Like one trick I've learned when I'm out and about and somebody's like, oh, let's take a picture, let's get video or whatever. You hand your phone to the youngest person, right? Because they're going to do the best job. They were born with these phones in their hands, so they know what they're doing. And so maybe by telling yourself, like, oh, I've learned something from someone younger than myself, or, whatever. So maybe it's okay that I am leading up or whatever language you use. I liked that.
Mhm. I think that's so true. I'm thinking of too, in my own experience recently at Medtronic, we had one of our executives who shared a story of when she came to the company. She came just during COVID. She came also in a role that was the first DEI officer in the company. Then George Floyd happens. She's new to the company. She's all of a sudden um, com completely remote. The world is falling apart. She's right in Minneapolis. She had just moved here and she was saying, like she's at a VP level at a huge company, and she's like, I was living there. I had my ex-husband living with me because he was falling on hard times. So he's living in my basement. So I had no comfort and space of like having this person I'm not really comfortable with anymore in my house. My son hates me because he's at a new school and he can't even go see people. And I'm trying to lead a huge company and talk about DEI. And, George Floyd was just killed. And she's like, talk about imposter syndrome, and so for me to know that someone at that level, who is an executive of a huge corporation, everyone experiences. And I think that as, PR professionals, it's not just us at that manager, director, level. People at every level of a company are going to experience that. All right.
that's great.
Um, yeah. I think Jill has a really interesting question here, Amy. We have a few minutes left for some Q&A. How do these imposter tenants, I'm sorry, when you live in a high conflict situation for years and years, how do you get out of it? I think this is true of life and work. I mean, there's times where you have work with really hard people or live with, or, have really hard people just in your life.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that subscale, the family environment scale is really helpful to kind of see how it continues throughout our lives in multiple roles that we have. Um, yeah, honestly, those types of high conflict, um, low expressive, low cohesion environments, I mean, what's so difficult is the best way to address those is to get out of those spaces, which isn't always possible. Um, so I think actually I do want to talk about infiltrator experience for a moment here because I think it's really relevant when we're talking about dismantling systems and creating spaces where imposter feelings don't grow, thrive. I mean, we are just putting Miracle Grow on it in a lot of ways. Um, so, so as I said, when this concept of imposter phenomenon is researched, demographic variables like gender, race, ethnicity don't show consistent impact. Um, and so it's evidence of this very universal experience. And at the same time, it doesn't dismiss the upstream influence that rigid or oppressive environments can play on imposter feelings. those isms, racism, sexism, ableism, all of these things that we know that create environments of chronic stress that harm populations, those isms increase anxiety. It's just that anxiety doesn't always lead to imposter feelings. So it's this manifestation that kind of needs some tuning. That's why we don't see the demographic impact in the imposter phenomenon research so clearly. Okay. So with that, I think that it's really important also to remember that this component of a skewed self-assessment is like that key piece of imposter phenomenon. And so if you are in a group or you're in a high control space, low expressive space, if you're in a space where you are told either clearly or passive aggressively or through microaggressions or through um, reduced pay, equity, whatever, if you're given the message that the way you are showing up is insufficient, is wrong, even when you're capable, then it's not your self-assessment that's off. You are you are being told you're not measuring up, and that's incorrect. So the problem isn't your self-assessment. And if we call that imposter phenomena, if we call that imposter feelings, if we call that imposter syndrome, then we're telling the wrong person to do the work. We're telling the person being assaulted within the oppressive structure to conform, to buy into the hierarchy, to maintain the structure. So there's some fascinating work here done by Dr. Nellie Tran that I really like to bring up. We're talking about imposter phenomenon. It's called it's called infiltrator experience. It's a way of recognizing what's really happening in these situations, that there is a high control space, there is an oppressive system, there's a low expression space, and how we need to acknowledge the impacts of that collectively, the burden of that, and also reclaim power. We can work to disrupt, transform, and reclaim those spaces for all of us. That is that powerful work of belonging and inclusion. So this is important to be really precise here, I think, so that we're not taking on these syndromes that we feel like we need to fix ourselves when the system is broken around us. So, let's do it. Let's disrupt.
Mhm. All right, we only have a few more minutes, but there's a couple really other great questions. I'm going to start to combine a few together because I think some of them have similar themes that you can address here, Amy. These are just great. Um, there's a couple we talked a little bit about this, like calm. Madison brings up like calm during the storm, during a crisis or uncertainty. How does that impact our view ourselves? I think similarly, Anne brought up in a competitive atmosphere full of corporate rifts, it feels like it's a necessity to always be producing at a higher, realistically high level. I think those kind of correlate. And then also Dorcas brought up, there's so much to consider and you validated a lot of feelings that come with trying to move forward. There's a constant battle between feeling frozen and burned out while trying to figure out the perfect plan in today's world, especially when you're just starting your career. Are there resources you can recommend to help prevent falling into a freeze burnout cycle so often? So I think these all have a nice theme of knowing we deal with critical issues, crises a lot, and that, again, to that final comment there, that freeze burnout cycle, with rifts, with, reductions in force for those who don't use common corporate language like that. Others, Anne also brought a question here of how do you move from imposter syndrome or working as a norm without looking like you're underperforming? Can you speak a little bit to sort of that, like we work, and I think you did earlier, that we work so hard, we put our whole selves into work, we don't even want to rest. We'd rather give ourselves a shock. So is there good practices we can do to like maybe force ourselves to slow down or force ourselves that calm during the storm?
Yeah, I mean, I think honestly, some of the work in cognitive behavioral therapy is really helpful here in what's called the cognitive distortions, understanding where we might have some kind of unhelpful patterns of thinking. One of those to consider is sometimes called effort justification. It's not technically a distortion, but it is in that realm. This idea that working harder is always good or going to pay off. It's this funny thing we humans do that we feel like if we're working harder, it's got to be worth it. God, so often it's just not. So there are things, and it's kind of surprising when you start to work with some of these cognitive distortions. Sometimes it's just identifying them, naming them, and then, seeing how they play out in your world and being able to challenge those distortions and creating new patterns of thinking, which takes practice. But it's skills work that we can all do. And I think when we do that work, ourselves, we do create systemic changes that, enable us to have the systems put in place to reduce overwork, overwhelm, exhaustion, burnout. But yeah, I would suggest a lot of times is these relationships with rest and work, looking at some of these cognitive distortions and working on skills training around those. We do a lot of that work at Joy Lab because it's so damn common. But it's surprisingly powerful. And this isn't like manifestation, toxic positivity BS. Like these are real distortions that trip us up in our unconscious that we can identify, name, and begin to work on so that we don't get caught in these cycles of thinking that we're imposters when we're not, for example.
Yeah.
And
That's
burning
great.
ourselves out, working harder to prove that to ourselves, which is kind of this funny cycle. I will work harder to improve that I am not an imposter. And then we just feed the cycle.
All right, I'm going to allow for one more question because we're just about at time. And one of them, I'm going to give a plug and an answer to that question. Keely asked, can you recommend any resources, other common challenges, ADHD, PTSD? We hear about all these all the time. My first recommendation is, of course, Joy Lab, but also check out, I'm going to put it in the chat, Natural Mental Health, where Amy is the CEO. She works with a brilliant partner, Dr. Henry Emmons, and several others. Dr. Emmons has a couple really great books that Amy recommended me years ago, made a huge difference for me in my own battles with generalized anxiety, Chemistry of Calm and Chemistry of Joy. So there's another couple book recommendations for more natural healing. Look at it. Amy, any other resources you would want to throw for folks too who are just looking for more support in that in general?
Yeah, I mean, it's really cool, some of the work around attention training as it relates to ADHD and imposter phenomenon, kind of recalibrating where we're placing our attention, and to prevent those kind of cycles of rumination. PTSD and imposter feelings generally get linked back into anxiety and also in that family environment scale. But I will look and see. Let me put my, oops. Oh, here's stuff on rest and play. Email me if you have other questions, because I will look in the research as far as PTSD and imposter phenomenon. I haven't seen much on it lately, but I'll check again if that's of interest. And anything else that we didn't cover, if folks want resources for, feel free to email me. Yeah, in the interest of time, I'll pause, but I could do one more question if folks want.
Yeah, I think we're right at time. So I'm going to wrap us up because I see a few people are already having to drop for probably for other meetings and things. So
Oh,
Amy,
there's that.
thank you
Yeah,
so much. The other thing is for folks who are here today, I know we
thanks,
have several
Daryl.
members and several non-members. We will be reaching out to you and connect more and share more about PRSA resources. So if you have joined us as a guest and a non-member today, our dear friend Leah Condas you can expect a wonderful call from her because she likes to connect with people after these sessions to tell you a little bit more about PRSA. So thank you for everybody for joining and for spending the time, and we'll get out these slides and other information after. So
Yeah,
Amy, thank you
thanks.
so much. I mean, huge round of applause, right? Virtual round of applause. And I'll let everybody go because I'm sure people have other meetings to run off to. So thank you.